I'm going to guess that almost everybody in this room knows who Tom Carothers is. Anyone who thinks about wanting to do a study of or get an authoritative and I'd say fiercely independent and ruthlessly principled and honest analysis of democracy promotion policies or institutions, and particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, how they intersect with even the more gigantic industry of development assistance, almost invariably they turn to Tom first, or Tom among a small set of people that they want to hear from. As you probably know, he's Vice President for Studies, as he has been for many years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is still one of the institutions that we are most fond and admiring of, notwithstanding a recent hire they made to direct their Carnegie Center in Beirut. He's the founder and director of their Democracy and Rule of Law program there that's become a real institution, and as I think you know, our undergraduates fight and dream about internships there, and one of your former year-long interns, I'm pleased to see Alexandra Blackman, our former TA, is PhD student here. Tom is also worked extensively with the Open Society Foundations. He's chair of the OSF Think Tank Fund and served as chair of the Global Advisory Board there. And he's been a consultant to many development agencies and foundations. He's an adjunct professor as well at the Central European University in Budapest. He's been a visiting faculty member at Nuffield College in Oxford and at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Prior to joining Carnegie, he was a practicing lawyer at Arnold and Porter, and then an attorney advisor in the office of the legal advisor of the U.S. State Department, and it was from that experience, if I'm remembering correctly, that he wrote his first book on rule of law assistance, if I'm remembering correctly. But in any case, I think you know that he has been a prolific author in writing about democracy promotion. And I won't give you the titles of all his books. It was in the announcement we made. But I will say that his most recent book, which has generated intense interest not only in the development studies community, but among development agencies, is Development Aid Confronts Politics, the Almost Revolution, which is what he's going to talk about today. He's very good soul to do this because I think this is the 33rd talk he's given about this stream of work and about this book in 11 different countries. But thank you for circling back to the United States and coming back to CDDRL, Tom. I'm going to pass out these flyers. If you don't need it, don't take it. But if you want it, take it. And if you don't have the book, please order it. Wow. Tom?
Goodness, Larry, thank you for that nice introduction, and thanks everybody for coming and spending a little time together with me. It's always really a great pleasure to be back at CDDRL and at Stanford more generally. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I love coming back. But I love especially coming back here to a center which is devoted to the issues I care about and has such an outstanding group of people, both students and faculty. Fields of knowledge which are uncertain about their basic operational principles are constantly subject to fads. The field of development and development assistance has been uncertain about its two basic foundations for over 50 years. The first is, how does development really occur? And the second is, how can outsiders have a positive effect on development? In some ways, amazingly enough, people are still arguing about the fundamentals of those two questions 50 years into this endeavor. The result is the field is subject to fads, ideas that bubble up and appear to be the magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. And when a field is subject to fads, it lives in a state of kind of existential uncertainty about whether the field is really advancing or whether the field is stuck in a kind of cycle of repeating itself and repeating ideas under new labels time and time again. In simple terms, as a metaphor that my author and I use, co-author Deanne de Gramont, who wrote the book together with me, she's at Oxford now, couldn't be here today, uses whether or not, in a sense, the field of development studies and development assistance is a river that's moving somewhere, or is it a whirlpool, probably a sort of warm one that we're stuck in which we find ourselves turning round and round? And as we were writing the book, Deanne used to send me little emails, and the subject line of them was called Guess the Decade. And she would send me a quote from a development policy report or a document of a development agency, and I would have to guess whether it was 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 00, or 10s. And she set up a little reward system for me based on how close I got to the truth. And we actually thought of creating an online game to this to get interest in the book called Guess the Decade. We haven't done it yet. We've been busy. And
We'll have a link to it on our website.
Thank you. And it's disturbingly difficult in some cases. There are certain clues, certain words that are fashionable and so forth, but ideas appear again and again. In recent years, the last 10 or 12 years, talk about politics and development assistance has surged, particularly within major development agencies where ministers give speeches and say we need to take politics into account in the working of agencies that now try to factor in politics in different ways. And coming as I did from, in a sense, a concentration on the democracy side of the assistance world in the 1980s and 90s, I've sort of watched this change occur and gotten interested in it and trying to make sense of it. And I'm fairly convinced that it's not another fad, that it's something more fundamental than that. It doesn't mean that it will succeed, but I think it goes deep. I think it goes deep to the core of what people are trying to do in development, and I think it goes deep into the core of how they're trying to create effective assistance. So that's what it's what we try to do in the book is, in a sense, tell that story by taking a fairly long arc of looking at development aid all the way back to the 1960s and trying to follow it through to trace this evolution. What I want to do today, quite briefly, is take you on that journey from the 1960s up to the present and give you a sense of where we are. Let's start by talking about, or let me start by talking about the term politics and development, because it's a very confusing term. The word politics is large, it's vague, it's hard to define, and it stirs up different feelings and thoughts in people. And I've learned in talking about the subject and writing about it that often people are thinking of something very different than what we mean in the book by thinking and acting politically in development. In one sense, development assistance, particularly that practiced by states, which is most development assistance, is inherently political and that it's used for political purposes. So the United States gives a lot of assistance to Pakistan, not necessarily because of a deep commitment to development in Pakistan, but because it's trying to secure an alliance with a government that's useful to it in counterterrorism terms. The fact that development aid is often political in this way, has sort of other political purposes than development, is a fact of life. It's been that way since the beginning, probably always be that way. I don't regard it as surprising or particularly disturbing. Sometimes leads to colossal mistakes, but it's just a fact of life. So I take that as a given and just kind of park it over there. In some cases, people raise that as though it's a revelation and it's shocking, and I just don't take it that way. A second meaning of politics is that development aid, which is intended to have social and economic consequences, often has political side effects which were not intended. And so aid may concentrate power in a country by helping a particular ministry or a particular governing elite by concentrating resources or allowing them to use aid programs to further their electoral ambitions and other things. It wasn't necessarily intended that way, but it's used that way. That's also a common element of development aid, has been again for decades, will continue to be, although there have been some efforts to improve that a little bit, and I take that as a given as well. So I'm not talking about unintended political consequences or other political purposes. What we are talking about is the explicit use or employment, if you will, in development assistance of political goals and political methods. By political goals, I mean when aid providers explicitly say we have political goals in this assistance, in that we are trying to affect particular political institutions to make them function better. So we are carrying out aid to strengthen the parliament of this country to make it a more effective representative or parliament, improve the judicial system, or so forth. Or they may even cast the political goal as a general systemic goal of saying we'd like to help support democracy in that country with the different component parts. So it's the explicit adoption of political goals in assistance. And then it's also the adoption of political methods. Political methods is a little harder to define. One way to define it is political methods are the opposite of technocratic methods. A technocratic method is you have a problem of corruption in the judiciary in the country, you invite some judges around the table and you have a training seminar on why corruption is bad. And so a big chart saying corruption is bad for these reasons, and you hope the transfer of knowledge will simply change the people's behavior. Or you inject capital into a particular situation through a loan or a grant and hope that by a simple transfer of capital you can change people's behavior. And political methods are different from that. They are an attempt to use assistance to, in a sense, get into the political bloodstream of sort of local conflicts of interest in a country and developmental processes of change. And so the actors who are trying to work towards some outcome, you try to become part of the scene with your assistance, empowering certain actors, maybe discouraging others, bringing some together, trying to facilitate a local political process of change. And so a political method is you might support a coalition that you believe is going to push for change in a particular place, and you hope that will be part of a process of change. So what's been happening is the adoption of both political goals and methods. Now let me talk a little bit about the history of how that's happened. Development assistance rests on a very strong apolitical foundation. It goes back to the 1950s and the 1960s, and it concerns both goals and methods. The development enterprise, particularly we see in the writings in the 1960s, was defined principally in economic terms as economic growth. And remember the stages of economic takeoff by Rostow, and defining economic growth or the reduction of poverty as the goal of development, and in a sense conceiving of development itself as about achieving a certain socioeconomic end. It was hoped or believed at the time that political development would follow on, and there was a strong element of sequentialism in thinking about development at the time, and people said if you get the socioeconomic development, of course, then there will follow political development through a process of kind of extended modernization. And so you didn't really need to focus on political development because that would follow from your socioeconomic development focus. This was both a result of economic thinking at the time about development, and we can go back and look at the sort of the main thinkers about that, and it was also the context at the time. In the Cold War, the United States and its European allies were giving development aid to a lot of governments that were useful anti-communist allies, and you didn't want to talk too much about some of their unpleasant political characteristics because you needed those relationships. And so being sort of apolitical in assistance was a way to maintain somewhat embarrassing or uncomfortable relationships in some ways. In addition, the methods of aid in these early years were startlingly technocratic. And when you go back and look and read reports of aid programs in the 60s, it really is remarkable, the belief that what the post-colonial world had was a bunch of nascent post-colonial states that had good intentions but simply lacked some capital and some knowledge, and once they had those things, would carry out a process of sort of well-crafted development. And that aid's job, there was a very much a white coat mentality about this, was in almost not disinterested, but at a distance from the society way to provide that capital and that knowledge to people in those countries. In a sense, I see Frank right here, there was an assumption that they really already had the germ of effective states, and you simply needed to put some fuel in the tank of those effective states, and then they would take off and move along. So the apolitical goals and methods of aid were profound and really built several generations of development experts and development work that has been very slow and difficult to change. I could go through it, I don't really have time here, the 1970s and 80s, where you see different sort of waves of thinking about development, but that still maintain their apoliticalness. For example, in the 1980s, the embrace of the market reform sort of miracle and neoliberalism, as it's called in many developing countries, was another wave of, I think, apolitical thinking about how development would happen. But then suddenly, the picture changes in the early 1990s, and it changes with startling rapidity. And again, it's striking when you're reviewing the documents. Suddenly you hit 1990 or 1991, and there's a complete change of language and a change of propositions or assertions in development documents. In 1991, for example, USAID issued a report, in addition to adopting democracy as a core pillar of USAID's work, which was startling at the time, that says, quote, political development is central to socio and economic development. Not follows from, but is central to the process of. And as is so often the case with sort of new truths in development thinking, it appears really without explanation in the document, as though eternal verities that weren't true a year ago are suddenly true today and will be true forever. And throughout the development world, from 1990 to 1993, there's a flood of interest in and talk about and some action concerning a whole series of terms: governance, democratic governance, democracy, the rule of law, institutions and institution building, in some cases civil society, and a whole series of terms around that. And in 1993, the OECD Development Assistance Committee has a sort of consensus document saying these sort of elements are now central to development work. Why did this occur? This is where it starts to get more complicated, and it's very important to follow that there were two lines of thinking that led to this that were very different from each other and are still present. They're like fissures in some ways in the foundation, but they're two different ones. One was, of course, the changed climate of the years, the international context with the end of the Cold War and the start of the largest expansion of democracy in the non-Western world in history. The development world wanted to respond. It was an exciting, it was a heartening time, it was inspiring, and in a sense the development community wanted to be part of it. How could you not? You'd wake up in the morning and suddenly Nepal was throwing out its monarchy and embracing democracy and all this aid in Nepal. You wanted to be part of that. I don't mean to make it sound simplistic, but there was simply a human response to say we want to be part of that. That was very much an intrinsic belief in the value of democracy. And you remember Amartya Sen was writing around the time of freedom as development and trying to argue that we should expand our conception of development to include human freedom and actually factor that in as part of the condition of being developed as being free. And so there was this intrinsic belief that this will be a good thing for these countries. And if you pushed those at the time who were sort of holders of this intrinsic mindset, probably include this guy among them, and said, are you really sure that if you're more democratic, you'll be more successful in development? They would have said, I think all good things go together. It's just, they must, because look at all the rich countries in the world. They've got these attributes, and surely this is going to be better for these countries if they adopt these governments. People were not arguing on the basis of empirical studies about the relationship of democracy and development. There was a huge leap of faith. So that was one line and one group thinking. There was another line which was extremely different, and it was a different group of people, which was the governance line, which was in the second half of the 1980s, some developmentalists at the World Bank and I'd say the British development world began getting very frustrated with market reform efforts in a number of countries and realized that the failure of institutions in these countries, or the weak institutions, were undercutting the developmental project. And they embraced the idea that traditional development should focus on institutions and then, as they described it, governance. And of course, Douglas North's fundamental writing of the time was very influential. These people were not intrinsic. They didn't sort of embrace the idea of better governance as just a great human thing. It was a very instrumental embrace. They said, we think these things are necessary for the socioeconomic goals that we've been pursuing. And so they pursued governance. So you had in the 1990s, and it's interesting when you go back, and I guess I was part of it at the time, is you had three different streams. You had some people, the latter, who embraced governance and were starting to pursue that for instrumental reasons. You had a democracy community that built up within some aid agencies and in organizations around them specialized in this, who believed in this more political project for intrinsic reasons. And then you had a rights world that also grew up in the 1990s in rights-based development, which was a different set of people, often in Northern Europe, the Scandinavians, who were very big in rights-based development, who felt that democracy was too ideological, governance too technocratic, and they really believed in rights as the basis of development. And these three communities at the time didn't like each other particularly, they didn't trust each other, and they were very, they had sort of different approaches, because the governance people at the time, for example, their ideal of a well-governed state institution was efficiency, and if anything, independence from politics. Their model was a central bank isolated from public opinion, not interactive with citizens, whereas the democracy people were very skeptical of a pure efficiency approach to state institutions and were all about trying to empower civil society and inclusiveness and this kind of thing. And then the rights people were skeptical of the democracy people as too ideological, and as I said, the governance people as sort of too technocratic. And so these three, what all were part of a stream towards more political approaches, were actually very different both in their motivations and in the kind of things they wanted to do. Now, in the first 10 years, from the early 1990s to the end of the 1990s, these political goals that were adopted by the development community, interestingly, were not pursued with very political methods. And so, as I said, you wanted to change the judiciary, and so you would think, well, we need to train some judges on how to be better judges. Or a program I remember reviewing in Nepal with the Nepalese parliament in the 1990s, a Northern European government said, we want to make this parliament work better, and so we'll give them better microphones because they don't hear each other very well. And so there's a lot of conflicts among them. And so they provided these microphones. And they discovered when they provided the microphones that Northern Europeans on average are a lot taller than Nepalese. And the microphones were much too tall, and then they had to get a second set of microphones that were tailored down to Nepalese, appropriate technology, as they called it in the project that I reviewed. And so, the conception was you're working on a very political project, but to approach it in very technocratic ways. Even the most political things, like political party assistance, and I did a lot of work on this at the time and later in a book, was very apolitical in its mindset. When you talk to political party people and said, you're trying to change these parties, they seem to be a cesspool of kind of corrupt interests and all kinds of reasons why they're not functioning the way you want. How are you going to help change that? They'd say, well, we're going to train them. Training was everywhere. Training was, again, the idea that knowledge will be the key that will do all of this. So for the first 10 years of this changed environment, there was a big embrace of goals, but actually not very much embrace of methods. And then it got more interesting in the next decade, the 2000s, when a lot of serious people who'd been pursuing the goals started saying we need to have more political methods. It started with the push towards more political analysis. Basically, a leading person at the British Development Agency in 2001 went away on a short sabbatical with the instructions, think about this problem. And she came back, Sue Unsworth, very notable thinker in this area, and said we need to do political analysis of the places we work, and we're going to call it drivers of change. We need to understand what are the drivers of change in a society, and how can development assistance be part of such a driver, or help foster one, or work together with it. And she started pushing for essentially political economy analysis of countries or sectors in which developmentalists were working. And this movement towards political analysis then began to spread across those years. Sweden adopted what it calls power analysis, which is something similar. The Dutch government undertook a whole series of studies of political economy analysis. The World Bank, through the work of Brian Levy and others there, developed a whole set of political economy analysis. So part of being more political was first actually understand the political realities of what you're trying to do, which sounds so startlingly obvious. You think, how was it only 40 years into this endeavor did you start to think that we need that? But I remember vividly in 2002, I was called to a meeting at the World Bank in the vice presidency for Europe and Eurasia. And I went to this meeting. I wasn't actually quite sure why I was there. And then they explained the problem that they had been funding a privatization program in Ukraine for a certain industry there that was a resource industry. It was important to the Ukrainian economy, and with Japanese money, they had funded an enormous technical study of privatization, over $1 million spent in the study. They prepared a loan to the appropriate ministry, and then the day before they signed the loan, 2 members of the Ukrainian parliament who had been bought out by this industry had passed a special legislation saying it's illegal to privatize this industry. And all of this preparation, all of this work was undercut by some corrupt interests in parliament. And they looked at me, a room like this, said, what should we have done about that? Kill those parliamentarians? Or, how do we stop this? This is terrible. Politics is intruding on development, they said. How dare it? And there was just this feeling of, this is it is shocking. And we have to do something about this. And so the instinct to understand was one response to that. But then there was a second, more important instinct, which was, if we're giving money or loans or advice to power holders and they're not actually interested in reform, they're not state power holders who really have incentives or believe in reform for whatever reason, then we need to work with other parts of the society. And there was this whole movement in the traditional development community towards participation and towards what they call demand-side reform, which is an economistic way of talking about more political work. You use the word demand because economistic, but what you try to do is work with citizens groups who are pushing on those power holders who are resisting reform. It's the start of a more political method of thinking about, aid is part of a process of struggle in countries and has to be empowering one side versus another. And there was this enormous buildup in the traditional development world over the last 10 years of work on the demand side. But it went through its own evolution of starting very technocratically. We'll only work with NGOs where everybody has a law degree or a business degree and speaks perfect English and has a technocratic agenda, to realizing that's not good enough. We need to work with NGOs that are more grounded in the society, and moving down a road towards more politically real kind of work. So there has been this movement towards more political methods. And there's also been, in the political goals, what's been interesting is the three streams that I talked about: democracy, rights, and governance. Frank, by the way, has heard this presentation twice before, so it's remarkable that he's here. These three streams the boundaries between them began to blur. And over time, the governance people, the democracy people, and the rights people kind of made peace with each other, partly because they began to realize they did have common interests, and partly they felt a bit surrounded in larger institutions where the broader sort of institution was not all that favorable to much of this work. And what happened is they converged around certain ideas that appeal to all three of them and represent common ground. And these terms, I've been calling them the four magic words of development, are the current buzzwords in the development world, where if you go to any development agency and you face a hostile audience, you just say these four words over and over again, and everybody smiles. And the four words are transparency, accountability, inclusion, and participation. Everybody is for those things. If you're not for those things, you're Darth Vader or something worse. And these are words which for the governance community represent an extended idea of governance. It's beyond efficiency to say, in addition to just being an efficient, non-corrupt institution, we need to be more inclusive, more participatory, more transparent, more accountable. If you're a democracy person, these are words which allow you to talk about politically sensitive issues with governments that don't like the word democracy in a way that's more acceptable. So democracy people regard them as stalking horses for democracy. And they say when the door is closed, if any country has all of these attributes, its institutions have these attributes, they'll have to be democratic. We've got them in a corner, in a sense. And so we can sit with the Chinese official and say, don't you want to be accountable to your people? And it's hard for that official to say, no, the Chinese Communist Party is not going to be accountable to its people. So their feeling is once you get them into a discussion of accountability, then you've laid the trap for democratic norms. The rights people like them because that's how they have tried to operationalize rights in development, is by saying a rights-based education program is a program where everybody has the right to education, so it's very inclusive. And inclusiveness and participation are key to the rights agenda. And so what's happened is the political goals have merged around a sort of feel-good set of concepts, which is a kind of consensus, but it's actually a sort of a thin consensus because there are very different ideas within it about what these terms mean. So where we are today, 50 years in, is actually the development world in the last 20 years has changed a lot. 10 to 15% of the 100 to 150 billion of overseas development assistance is now spent on programs that have explicit political goals, somewhere between 10 and 15 billion dollars a year. And most of these programs are pretty cheap, so there's a lot of activity. Thousands and thousands of people are out in over 100 countries in the world carrying out programs that have some explicit political component to them. In addition, within every development agency, there are groups of people sitting, pushing on this agenda in different ways, either on the method or on the goals at different levels of the institution. And these issues are part of the development discourse now. So it sounds like, in a way, a revolution has occurred, but the book is subtitled The Almost Revolution because I think the revolution is at best sort of halfway up the hill of change, and I'm not sure whether it's going to get all the way up to the top and go over to the other side or slip back down over time. Why is that? Why is it still, I think, actually surprisingly partial and somewhat fragile within most institutions? And it's striking when you work with the people within any of the major aid agencies who's most interested in this agenda, they regard themselves as a kind of besieged, precarious minority within this institution. I recently asked someone at the World Bank who's involved in this agenda, I said, what percentage of people at the World Bank sort of, quote, believe in your view? And her view is she happens to work on political economy analysis. And she said somewhere under 5%. That's where I think I am at the institution I work at, and that's shared at most, except for maybe, well, I won't sort of mention other specific institutions. There are a couple where maybe the figure would be somewhat higher. Why is it so partial? Why is this so difficult? There are a number of reasons. The first is, actually intellectually, it's very difficult and very complex. The instrumental case for governance, better governance leading to better socioeconomic outcomes turns out to be very complicated and very difficult in that it is, to boil it down into simplistic terms, the China model or versions of that discussion that, many people are getting out of poverty in countries that do not have governance that resembles the good governance agenda of the Western institutions is a fact, and a fact that represents, an important both intellectual issue and practical issue for how certain are we that we know how governance relates to socioeconomic outcomes. I don't have time to go more into that here. We actually have a sort of a chapter on that debate trying to review the different sides. Frank, of course, done fundamental work on this, and I think would agree with me that it's surprisingly complicated after all these years. The mere fact that a book like the Acemoglu and Robinson book, which came out on Why Nations Fail, which makes a fairly simple, in some ways simplistic argument about the importance of inclusive institutions, again came out 50 to 60 years into this enterprise is amazing. It's such a basic book. I mean, it's a good book in some ways, but it's so basic. You have to scratch your head and say, why wasn't that in the first 5 years? Why did it take us a half century to get to that insight? And are we even really sure of it? So the first reason why this is partial is there's still an ongoing argument, especially in those aid agencies that invest a lot in thinking and research, like the bank, the British Aid Agency, and a couple of the Northern Europeans, that are still arguing a lot internally over this. And those who are sort of, quote, for this agenda find themselves in meetings with pretty tough macroeconomists who say, okay, can you prove to me that $1 million investment in a certain kind of governance program or a certain kind of political study will lead to X results socioeconomic? Prove it to me. Show me the study that proves that to me. It's still hard when faced with that question. It's still hard to give a convincing answer. That's the first reason. Second is that the intrinsic case for this, the belief that these are just good things and we should make it part of our conception of development, hasn't really won the day. Amartya Sen is still a hero and still gets large audiences when he speaks, but within the development community, the idea of freedom as development has not carried the day. Growth and poverty reduction remain the bread and butter of development work. And Amartya Sen is, in some ways, may have been ahead of his time, but I'm not sure if his time is going to come. Only the Swedish Development Agency, it's the only development agency in the world that says that freedom is part of development. It says it on their website. It's fundamental to the Swedish conception of development. It's the only one that has moved in that direction. For everyone else, the intrinsic agenda is essentially a nice thing standing next to, but it's not essential to development. And when faced with a case like Rwanda or Ethiopia of a government that's fairly developmental but not very free, for the most part, the community will still go and say, we need to help that government and they're doing good things and let's not bother them politically. Third reason is the institutions that built up around the development enterprise were built on an apolitical conception of how to operate, and they're very ill-suited to adapting to more political methods. More political methods usually mean a longer period of study and reflection, more time getting to know the local situation, a more flexible kind of project design, or maybe doing away with projectized aid altogether and trying to create facilitative relationships, not having really predetermined goals, but letting your goals evolve based on as you learn and the situation changes over time and so forth. And it's very hard to put in such methods into institutions of assistance that were built largely to control risks, prevent corruption, and convince skeptical publics that money is not being wasted. And so you have a set of institutions that were built up largely for certain other reasons that are trying to be adapted in some cases for different kinds of assistance. And it's a very difficult fit. And there's a strong sense when you visit aid programs on the ground and you'll see a terrifically interesting and innovative project in a particular country, and you talk to the local director of that program or project, he or she is almost always in friction with their bosses. They're fighting for more flexibility. They're trying to get away from a results agenda, which is pushing in on them and asking them to measure results in a way that doesn't really fit what their intuition tells them is something good that's happening, and so forth. And the growing results sort of frenzy in the aid world, and I use that word purposely, it is a frenzy which reflects the lack of public support for aid in most Western societies, is very damaging to the more political agenda because the results frenzy pushes you to a back to basics mode of just do the things that you're sure are doing good, whether it's delivering bed nets or giving books to kids in schools or things that you think you're sure are going to be good for development. The fourth reason is the reactions of the other side. In a sense, Western developmentalists kind of came to this agenda, decided it was a good thing, and then have had to go out to a skeptical world and sell it and say, guess what? We want to do things differently. And for many countries on the other side or people on the other side of the development equation, this has been unpleasant news. It's unpleasant news both because it involves changing who the aid goes to. So you're saying to governmental partners that are used to the aid going exclusively to them, we're going to direct aid to other parts of your society, and you're no longer going to be the keepers of all of the aid. And in addition, we're not just going to focus on the incontrovertible goal of reducing poverty. We're going to talk about things that you may be uncomfortable with, about political norms and democracy and so forth. And it is still 20 to 25 years into this revolution, a very difficult discussion between the donor community and the recipient side over the legitimacy of this entire enterprise. You see this in the post-2015 Multi-Millennium Development Goals discussion, which is taking up an enormous amount of time and energy in the development community. It's amazing how many people are working on this. And the reason it's taking up a lot of time and energy is there is a lack of consensus between the providers and recipients of aid about whether to have governance, participation, human rights, and all these norms as a part of the agreed upon goals of development aid. And there remains a strong sense on the side of recipients that this is really either a hypocritical agenda, it is in a sense an ulterior cause for some kind of political subversion, and so forth. And there is, as you know, a rising pushback growing towards, particularly towards civil society assistance. I have a short book coming out next week, I didn't mention it to you, Larry, called Closing Space, Democracy and Human Rights Support Under Fire, which chronicles how in over 50 countries in the last 6 or 7 years, governments have passed laws to restrict external ability to provide funds for civil society organizations and a whole series of other measures to constrain the space for what they regard as too politically sensitive assistance. And so in a way, this pushback shows that, there's been this long evolution on the part of the providers to say we need to think and act more politically, and they are running into considerable pushback from a set of recipients who say, you decided this without consulting with us, and we don't necessarily want this. And then, final reason, adding to this is, in a more general sense, the shift of power in the world, in a simplistic sense between the West and the rest, is changing the aid landscape in a way that first, Western political and economic models of governance are less unquestionably credible or legitimate than they were 20 or 25 years ago. There's a lot more competition of ideas out there over forms of governance. And secondly, other providers of assistance, not just the Chinese, but lots of other non-Western countries are now in the assistance business, whether it's Turkey and India, and South Korea, and Brazil, and lots of others are out there offering different approaches, different models, different ideas about politics. And no longer, was there a simplistic equation of here is a preferred political model of governance, now you just need to do this and you'll get to that. There's now a much wider and much more difficult discussion about these issues. And so it's a puzzling picture. There's what I think is a fundamental evolution in the development business away from static, stale, and unnecessarily kind of narrow and models of thinking about what development is and how it changes and what assistance should be. And I think this is actually one of the most important and positive developments in development assistance since its inception. Yet, it is running into considerable resistance intellectually, practically, and in every other way within and outside the organizations that are trying to carry it out. So that's why it's called the Almost Revolution. That's why I wrote a book about it. I think it's up for grabs. I'm not actually quite sure which way it's going to go. I'm not in the business of making either political predictions or predictions about the policy world moving forward. But right now, at least, I would say the prospects are very uncertain that many of these good ideas will really be taken forward and there'll really be a synthesis of thinking about these issues. If it happens, it's only going to happen because of further thinking, further ideas driving this, further innovation, and so forth. So it's going to be up to all of us and people out there working on these issues to see whether it will be taken forward. When you study these large arcs of kind of policy history, it's just people, it's ideas, it's individuals who wrote fundamental articles that changed people's thinking. It was Sue going on vacation or on a sabbatical in 2001, coming back and starting a whole field of political economy analysis and development as a result. And so it's up to us in a way and up to everybody working on this to decide whether this almost revolution, in what ways it could or should be completed and whether it will. Thanks for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tom.